This video is about something that I have outlined before, but as part of another series, and I think it's worth its own standalone video, so skip it if you already know what I'm going to say. The subject of this video is about discrimination, anti-discrimination efforts specifically, and I was spurred to finally make it by something I saw 2 weeks ago. So I was watching the interview between Sargon of Akkad and Jared Taylor, and the whole anti-discrimination issue came up. It's the whole thing where Christian bakers must bake a gay wedding cake and so on. Sargon says,
I mean, I'm actually on the side of bake the cake, to be honest. I know. I'm not a very good libertarian. The gay cake. If you're going to serve the public, then I think you should serve the public indiscriminately.
Why? Why must I do business with people I prefer not to do business with?
Because eventually what it'll do is it'll create a class of second-class citizens within their own country who can do very little about it.
The thing about the bake the cake issue is that the danger doesn't lie solely in one direction. In one direction you have the danger of creating a second class of citizen, as Sargon worries about in his interview with Jared Taylor, but in the other direction you have the danger caused by anti-discrimination law, and that danger lies in using the metric of discrimination itself. The problem with anti-discrimination legislation is that it sets up a precedent in which discrimination is de facto bad, regardless of context, when in reality context is very important in deciding whether it is justified. Using discrimination as a metric encourages the conception that less discrimination in society is always good and that we can just infinitely suppress discrimination to perfect society more and more over time. The main danger that comes from the intersectional left isn't political correctness or postmodernism or divergent distortions of Marxist theory, but from its desire to take abstract concepts like diversity, equality and anti-discrimination and attempt to maximise them without any other principles getting in the way to moderate this accelerating process. It may be distasteful that someone dislikes black people, but this is a preference that can have harmful effects, not something intrinsically harmful, and every time someone exercises a preference, in the form of a choice, this is quite literally a form of discrimination, as you're discriminating between one thing and another. Racism and sexism are actually historically privileged forms of discrimination that have been plucked out above other forms of discrimination for special treatment due to circumstance. And yet, because of this, the concept of discrimination per se has been tainted, which means that over time the number of special interest groups that are trying to feed out of the same trough grows. At first it was black people who became a protected class, then women and gay people, and then trans, and now a growing number of subjective identities that are hard to measure outside the subject's self-perception, as we've seen in New York and tentatively in Canada. So the identities included have escalated. But not only this, but also anti-discrimination as a general sentiment has accelerated from the point of being there to protect consumer rights to enforcing quotas on businesses in terms of their hiring practices. Now we are at the point where it is being used to police communication. All of the skeptic community on YouTube, along with everyone to their right, hates these things, but I think that the quote-end-quote skeptics have a hard time seeing just how deep the problem is. If there is one thing I want you to take away from this, it's this. Don't universalise abstractions trivially. Meritocracy of any kind is impossible without discrimination per se. I think we can utilise a better metric than discrimination, and this is the same when people talk about economic equality and things like that. This better metric is based on physical impoverishment due to lack of access to services. Why is this a better metric? First of all, it avoids the lunacy of framing discrimination as de facto bad. Secondly, the dangerous abstraction of discrimination as a negative metric includes its subjective manifestations. Under the current system, I can discriminate against someone inadvertently and still pay the full penalty under the law. I can discriminate not only by excluding people, but by being insufficiently inclusive. At the end of the day, it's all just discrimination. At that point, you run into difficulties coming up with measures of exclusion and inclusion. An important principle with a legal metric is whether the problem it's trying to tackle is easily measurable and separable from other things. For example, if we base hate speech law on the perceived offence of the victim, then the result will be that the law is dictated not as a written rule but as the whim of anyone who wishes to put away someone they dislike. Physical deprivation does not have this disadvantage as a metric, as it is measurable from the outside and lacks as many edge cases. If we make this the relevant metric, then as mentioned, We also avoid tainting the concept of discrimination as a general bad and maintain its useful aspects. So, if we apply deprivation instead of discrimination to policy, how does the legal landscape change? First of all, if we aren't concerned about discrimination, quotas and affirmative action are out the window. Employers would be free to pick the best candidate for the job without making sure their office resembles a pack of Skittles first. Next, exclusion would change. People would have the general freedom to disassociate from others through the use of private property, which would not only allow for more efficiency but also lead to a happier society without the forced intermingling that fuels the alt-right and bolsters the arguments of Jared Taylor, the self-styled white advocate. But this is no complete 100% laissez-faire libertarian state of affairs. With deprivation as a foundational metric, instead of looking at whether discrimination has occurred per se, look at the context in which it has occurred. We would then be able to select the kinds of markets which are necessary for direct measurable sustainability of life and prevent them specifically from discriminating. For example, dedicated and private cake makers are a specialised luxury goods service. No one eats solely cake and solely at weddings, whereas supermarkets are not. And food and drink purveyors would be susceptible to inclusive edicts, whereas gadgetry purveyors, specialists and clubs would not. Items for commission are different from open services. Big business should have a different level of responsibility than small business. So we could apply a progressive regulation counterpart to progressive taxation, and say that huge oligopolistic entities should not discriminate, though the exact line is arbitrary and will require hashing out in the real world beyond the realms of theorising. The number of businesses in sustenance markets in a given area could also be taken into account. There are a number of different ways we could do this, and better or worse implementations, but the advantages gained versus the flat discrimination metric are that we avoid the singular focus on mandated inclusion in every context, and allow individual preferences to be expressed to a greater degree, but at the same time protect people from the dark side of human choices in the most measurable way we can under the circumstances. There should be no right to be liked. If you define a second-class citizen in terms of discrimination alone, then you're essentially saying that they have a blanket right to be accommodated by people who don't like them. I think what's actually important is whether they are able to live in purely material terms. Rights should revolve around the material, the matter of survival, subsistence, absence of deprivation, etc., not around whether or not discrimination occurred at all. That's how you get a society where people can exercise their choices with their property and where they aren't forced to engage with people they don't like, where Jews aren't forced to bake cakes for Nazis, but simultaneously protect the rights of minorities to have a place to live, food to eat and water to drink. And the larger, more encompassing private and public entities bear a greater degree of the responsibility in fulfilling these material outcomes. If you don't protect these rights, the minorities might die or suffer. But if you try to blanket attack discrimination, make everyone get along and force service in all contexts at all times, then you will get a society in which dislike turns into hatred.